And now on WRS, Michael McKay with the McKay Interview.
Hello everyone. I'm interested in words that we use every day and almost take for granted to the extent that we often use or confuse or even forget their original meaning if we ever knew it at all. Saying that does not mean that I don't accept that language is dynamic and can change with time. Of course it does. And for today's program, I have particularly in mind words and phrases in the English language that are used, or so it seems to me anyway, much more frequently than, say, 40 or 50 years ago. And I don't mean new inventions like iPhone, or microchip, or software. Words spring to mind like racism. One hears a lot of it these days. There's a word in the Oxford Dictionary called racialism, but one hardly hears it mentioned these days, though the words are obviously connected but have different meanings. So what does racism actually mean if it is used so frequently that it ceases to have real meaning? Well, that's another debate for another program maybe. And another overused word in quite a different context, and in my opinion, is risk, the topic of my program today. I seem to hear and read it frequently, much more than when I was younger. I think I know what it means. My faithful, concise Oxford Dictionary confirms my understanding when it writes risk, a noun, hazard, chance of or of bad consequences, loss, etc., exposure to mischance. And we all know phrases, even use them ourselves, like our children are at risk of this or that. Well, what does that really mean? Look, I'm no expert on this, and that's why I sought clarification from someone who knows a lot more than I do about this subject. Why is it important? Because it seems to me that a whole industry has grown up over the past 20 to 30 years to manage, mitigate, and even regulate against risk. To take just one industry example, look at financial services. I have friends and acquaintances whose business cards carry the title Chief Risk Officer. I'm sure some of you do too. Maybe you're one yourself. Now, I hope that you'll stay with me and listen to my guest today, an old friend, Professor Bill Durodie, who is on the phone from Oxford. He's Professor of Risk and Security in International Relations at the University of Bath in England. I think you'll find his explanations and point of view interesting and thought-provoking. Hello, Professor Durodie. Hello, Bill, and thanks for making time for me.
Hello, Michael. It's been far too long since we've been together.
Once this COVID thing's out of the way, we'll have lunch either in Oxford or wherever you choose.
Okay, that'd be wonderful.
By the way, dear listeners, and you, Bill, my awareness of the depth and breadth of meaning of the word risk came to me years ago when I worked in the tobacco industry, and I learned then of absolute risk and relative risk. And today we hear the word risk used over and over again in the context of debates about COVID-19, the coronavirus pandemic, climate change, obesity, diet, and what not to eat and drink. The word is also linked to or in association with fear, vulnerability, safety, and security. Bill, you've made a professional and academic study of risk. How do you define risk?
Well, I think you've covered the areas on which it touches very well there, Michael. I think my starting point with anybody is always to take them back to the kind of the formula that some risk analysts use, which suggests that risk is a combination of probability and impact. So it's the likelihood of something happening combined with its effects, if you like. But that immediately raises some problems. We all know that a probability, if we can measure it, is a numerical quantity somewhere between 0, impossible, and 1, absolute certainty. But how do we measure impact? I mean, the impact on me of being in a car accident this afternoon may be very different to that on another person, because we have different tolerances, different expectations. We're different people. We assess things subjectively. So one of the first challenges of risk is how do we quantify qualities such as the effects or impacts? I already pointed to the fact that we can't always know the probability. Coronavirus is a fantastic example of that. When it started, and even now, it's very difficult to assess these things when we don't have accurate numbers.
So let's go
and in
down
that
a bit.
regards, we're not really talking about risk anymore. We're talking about uncertainty.
So let's go a little bit more deeply into that. Well, these two types of risks that I remember from all those years ago, absolute and relative. Is my recollection, first of all, correct, Bill? Are there more aspects to risk than just those two things? And what is the difference between the two, absolute and relative? Why is it important, particularly, that ordinary people like me understand and question that difference when we hear or read the word risk? And lastly, it's a bit of a long question. This word risk, is it in fact much bigger than its simple short four letters?
Well, I think you're right to distinguish between absolute and relative, and probably the best way of dealing with that is to give a concrete example. My mind goes back to the 1995 third generation oral contraceptive panic.
Okay.
I don't know if many of your listeners are even alert to that or can remember that far. But what it was that a new generation of oral contraceptive pills came on the market with some specific synthetic hormones.
What was it called? Or can you say the name? Can you say the name
of the hormones?
Of this medicine, this medication.
Well, it's just the oral contraception for women.
Yeah.
But what it led to was that the medical authorities, in their great wisdom, decided to alert 1.5 million who were taking that pill to the possibility that there might be an elevated chance of developing a thrombosis from taking the pill. Now, a thrombosis, as we all know, is a blood clot somewhere in your body. That's not a nice thing to have. But the absolute chance that they were talking about was of 1 in 11 million, which is minuscule by anybody's proportions. But of course, they didn't put it in those terms. They said that they had detected the possibility that it might be twice as high. Now, twice as high sounds like an enormous increase. That's the relative risk, if you like. But of course, to shift from 1 in 11 million to 2 in 11 million is not that vast by all standards. What it did lead to was about a third of women carried on taking the pill, half of women switched to a different contraceptive, and the remainder stopped taking the pill altogether. What was noticed within a year was a vast increase in pregnancies that led to abortions. Now, let me tell you something, Michael. Both pregnancy and abortions are not risk-free activities, as all our female listeners will know. Yeah. And in fact, pregnancy itself carries a considerable risk of developing a thrombosis. So actually what had happened was that the risk was displaced from one category to a different one through a confusion over what is the real risk as opposed to its relative increase. And twice something very small is still very small.
Just for the sake of clarity, that communication, if we put it that way, came from the manufacturers, or did it come through the media interpreting what the manufacturers have said, or was it a bit of both?
It was the government health authorities, actually.
Government health authorities, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, another great example, very briefly, is, after the Fukushima nuclear power disaster in Japan, after the Great Tohoku earthquake, people in Scotland measured an increased background radiation level of 12 microbecquerels. Now, again,
what is that?
Exactly. Some people might be alarmed to notice that, an event the other side of the world has an effect over in Scotland. But actually, to put it in terms that ordinary listeners might be able to understand, it was akin to going to a beach in the morning and asking yourself, who added those 12 grains of sand there overnight? That's the proportionality that we need to keep in mind.
Oh, God.
And that's a sign of how accurate our measurements are nowadays.
So let's move on a little bit. Life is terminal, as we know, Bill. We teach our children when they're very young and until they reach the age of adult responsibility to manage risk, whether learning to ride a bicycle or crossing the road, rock climbing, or when they're older, how to be wary and manage illicit drugs like alcohol or tobacco, or, heaven forbid, adolescent encounters with illicit drugs, narcotics, and their very serious consequences. But do you have a more profound view of risk because of your professional and academic background? And before you answer that question, let me put one more brief question to you. Perhaps it's an unfair question. Is life, in your opinion, more risky today than it was, say, 50 or 100 years ago?
Well, I don't know if my view is more profound, but my personal opinion, if you like, is that there's no evidence of more risks confronting us today than previously. And I think most people would agree that previous societies, particularly in the 20th century, which was a fairly bleak century, punctuated by 2 world wars and economic recession. We have to remind ourselves people, even in developed countries, still starving at the beginning of that century. Life is undoubtedly, I suspect, less risky than it's ever been, and not just in the developed world, but right across the world, including sub-Saharan Africa. And we can assess that in terms of longevity and even the wealth that people have, marginal as it may be in some places. I think what's happened is our perceptions have changed. It's not so much that risk has changed, but how we perceive the world that we're living in. Some people talk about new risks that we've developed with new technologies, such as nuclear power, for instance. But of course, you do need to compare that to the old risks that we would have faced in the past, such as starvation, disease, and still do, like tsunamis and earthquakes. And I think those new risks soon pale into insignificance in many instances.
So what's going on here then, Bill? Tell me why you say what you say. Because I mean, I personally agree with you to some extent on that, but what's going on when you really dig into that the perception has changed?
Well, I think we need to be very careful. I think in many ways, people are living their lives in more isolated ways today than even a generation ago. If we look at the kind of connections between families, neighborhoods, and communities, there's a considerable literature suggesting that a lot of our social bonds have been eroded over many decades now. A very famous American academic, Robert Putnam, wrote a book about this called Bowling Alone that some of your listeners might wish to fish out and look at. And in that, he looks at that breakdown of community bonds. And at the same time, many people, until recently at least, have become less and less interested in the political processes governing their societies. We can see that from the demise of membership of political parties, membership of trade unions, and even voter turnout until quite recently. And I think once you're becoming disconnected from your society and even from your neighbours and communities, you're living life much more on your own than ever before. And one of the consequences of living life on your own is your perceptions become out of proportion to the reality of the threats that are out there. I think the issue you picked on earlier, children, is a particularly important example. It led me actually to decide to leave the United Kingdom in, I think, 2008, because the government brought in what they called the Safeguarding Vulnerable Groups Act, which basically said anyone who comes into contact with children has to be assessed for their criminal records. Now, just because I haven't done something nasty to a child on a Monday doesn't mean, for a start, that I might not change my mind on a Tuesday. But more importantly than that, and I'll finish on this point, I think it sent a terrible message to children that adults can't be trusted and they have to be vetted for their criminal records. I can't think of a more corrosive message to send to the next generation than that you can't trust other adults.
But Bill, sorry, let me just pick you up on that. We did two things. Well, first of all, isn't it the case that we've never been better connected? And isn't it the case that particularly in relatively wealthy northern Western societies, we're more traveled? We move around a lot more than our parents and grandparents. So how can you say that we're more isolated?
Well, I think that's a good point, Michael. I think we're obviously more connected technically as we are today. But I think in terms of face-to-face contact, for a lot of people, that's becoming attenuated. And of course, the coronavirus has accelerated that. And even if you look at the kind of connections that people make, we are alert to the fact that people are increasingly choosing to live in echo chambers today with people that they consider to be like-minded or of similar opinions. They no longer read a newspaper from cover to cover, disagreeing vehemently with particular comment writers, but prefer to select the media that they, read from particular webcasts.
And as an academic, there's evidence for that, or is that anecdotal, Bill?
Oh no, there's considerable evidence for that, and I think it's led to a society in which we talk a lot about tolerance, but actually we've lost our understanding of the meaning of the word tolerance, which means to actually ruthlessly disagree with others whilst agreeing not to hurt ourselves as a consequence. What people call tolerance today is really turning a blind eye to things that they find unpalatable or disagree with. And that's actually indifference. And it reflects the kind of disconnections that I'm talking about.
Interesting. My guest today is Professor Bill Durodie of Bath University in England, and we're discussing risk. Bill, if it is the case that the adult population in some, it would be too sweeping a generalization to say all societies is becoming more anxious about risk, here's to me the real nub of the question. Who gains? Who benefits from that anxiety and fear? And please explain why, in your opinion, this is happening.
Well, I think we shouldn't be too cynical in terms of thinking somebody gains. But I think it's important, for instance, to start by... I
didn't mean to be cynical about it. I wasn't being cynical. I was more skeptical than cynical, Bill.
Well, that's good. Healthy skepticism is always good. And of course, there are different types of gain. So some academics have pointed to what they call risk entrepreneurs who evidently make money out of selling precautionary measures. My mind goes back to the early stages of the so-called war on terror, and there was discussion of possible attacks on the London Underground using chemical weapons. And there were obviously businesses wanting to make money out of that, and they were selling survival kits for the London Underground that included covers for your face, water to drink, and even atropine injections should you consider yourself to have been affected. I don't know how many people actually bought those. I remember going to a conference in Whitehall where somebody came up to me in the break and said to me, "I've got the supply of respirators all ready and waiting. All I need is something to stimulate the demand." So there are risk entrepreneurs out there making real money. But at the same time, and I think it's important to distinguish it, our public authorities do not make economic capital out of risk, but they can make moral capital. It's important for them to be seen to be doing the right thing. Whether they actually do the right thing, of course, is an entirely different matter.
Give us an example, Bill, of moral capital. Come on, let's really talk concretely. Give me an example.
Well, moral capital is, another word for it, I suppose, nowadays that's become quite fashionable is virtue signaling. It's to display that you know and that you're looking after other people. Maybe a good example of that is you'll recall that after the original SARS outbreak over a decade ago, some airports around the world started introducing thermal scanners to scan their passengers as they walked by. Now, SARS is noticeable by a high onset temperature in the early stages. But the thermal scanners were wheeled out again in 2009 for the H1N1 influenza pandemic. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you H1N1 or swine flu or Mexican flu, as it was variously known, does not have an early high temperature. So obviously those scanners were there as a signal, as a message to people that, look, we're doing what we need to be doing to be looking after you. But actually, they were completely useless and ineffective. And that's what I mean by moral capital. You're kind of signaling that you're looking after other people. Whether you make a real difference is a different question.
So let's look at this from another direction. Let's sort of try and slice the cake a bit differently. Here's at first, my opening question is, are we too cautious, in your opinion, these days? But here's my question. How can we be more savvy about making more good choices, whatever good means? And take, for example, food labeling or alcohol labeling, or even in the extreme, tobacco products labeling. What information, in your experience, is the most likely to inform the consumer about the risks involved in consuming a product bought and used in the way it's intended? Do you have a point of view on that?
Sure. I mean, at the end of the day, there's a limit to how much information the consumer actually wants to have. We don't go to the supermarket in order to read and digest all of the safety labels and even delve into the background literature that explains the terminology used. That would be a very time-consuming activity. Let's start with the tobacco labeling, which obviously you have experience of. When I was young and when you were young, Michael, there were no warning labels on tobacco. Eventually, it started off as a single strap line that tobacco might be bad for your health. Then it became a stronger message to the effect that tobacco kills or causes lung cancer. Then it started covering half the cigarette packet, eventually the entire packet, and then was replaced by images of diseased lungs and missing throats, and now, as we know, plain packaging. The reality is there's a small percentage of people out there who continue to enjoy smoking tobacco. They're not put off by these messages. And my suspicion is because they don't read them as warnings in the first place. The warnings become bigger and shriller the more people disconnect from them. They actually have become inured to warnings. They live in a world surrounded by warnings. We're warned about people sneezing in our face on a Monday, our children being abducted on a Tuesday, international terrorism on a Wednesday, the food and alcohol we consume on a Thursday. And with that cumulative impact of warnings, people do begin to switch off and interpret warnings as alien messages from remote authorities that they have no relationship with and don't particularly care about. That's a problem for government, by the way, because they now need to work out how to issue warnings in a way that doesn't just add to that background cacophony.
In the interest of fairness, even though I worked in the industry for a long time years ago, I should say also that there are some who will tell you that these people are hopelessly addicted and therefore can't help themselves. So that's the other side of the coin. But I just want to go into something quite different right now regarding big data. What do your studies tell you about the increased risk to our safety, our security, because that's in your sort of academic title, and our well-being because of big data and its possible misuse? We're being filmed by closed-circuit television much more than we used to. In some countries, like in the UK, some more than others, we're being filmed in order to keep us safe, so we're told, to reduce risk from petty criminals, even worse, to keep us safe from terrorists who threaten our safety. And thinking of what happened in Manchester, London, Paris, Nice, Madrid, Brussels Airport, the list is long. But in fact, how much at risk are we when you look at the other side of the coin of being filmed all the time? I mean, do you have any Western European examples of risk in the context of big data and closed-circuit television?
Well, maybe it's best if I start with a caveat, Michael, to the extent that, originally I studied physics at university. So I'm all in favor of having scientific evidence and putting it to good uses. I do think, however, that the discussion about big data has kind of run ahead of what we actually achieve with the kind of data that we collect. A lot of people talk about gathering big data in order to switch the central heating on remotely in their house before they get there, or logistical preparations for just-in-time operations in business. They're all fairly marginal gains, and I think until we actually advance our ability to interpret data rather than just collect it and presume its meaning, then we're actually, in some instances, no further advanced. I mean, there's a particular phrase that some of your listeners may be familiar with called the Internet of Things, when the presumption is that with the fifth generation telecommunications, all our gadgets are going to be interconnected. And the point I would make in relation to that is that we tend to emphasize the internet part of that couplet and not talk so much about the things. And I think we need to change the world of real things in which we live if we're going to have real security related impacts. I remember having to give a talk in London about this and traveling from my university in Bath an hour and a half away. And apart from the fact that that's an incredibly slow journey on a thing that was still dated from the 1970s, which was the intercity trains, the air conditioning, which is an invention over 100 years old, wasn't working on the train. So that gives you a fantastic example of how our internet and communication systems are highly integrated and connected, but the things that we actually live with are pretty dated and old. I think on the whole, we're displacing security threats. I mean, when I look at the kind of queues outside children's activity areas in the United Kingdom, in the world that we live in now with coronavirus, you realize that whilst the people inside whatever institution it may be, whether it's a school or a children's playground, are making sure that everybody washes their hands and maintaining their distance. The reality is they've displaced a concentrated queue of people just outside, just as we see at airports.
You mean a bit, I didn't quite follow you. Do you mean like sort of moving air in a balloon? Is that what you mean? You squeeze it and it just moves somewhere else?
Yeah, I think a lot of the early research, at least in relation to CCTV or closed circuit television, tended to show that its real impact was to displace criminal activity from one part of town to another, where there was less coverage.
Last question. We have to be topical, Bill, and let's finish on COVID-19. What do your academic studies tell you about how much at risk we are to this new virus? Or even though many of us have real anxieties about the dangers to our health and well-being, is it still too early to say?
Well, I think it is too early to say, Michael. I think I wouldn't even talk about it in terms of risk. And I touched on that at the beginning. I consider COVID to be an uncertainty, something where we simply don't have sufficient data to be making sweeping decisions about. Of course, we do need to take necessary precautions. And the core things that we knew very early on was that particularly the elderly, for some particular reason, and those with underlying health conditions were at greater risk than other constituencies or communities. The mistakes that have been made by particular governments across the world tend to have been related to not protecting those elderly communities, whether those are in care homes or other places. My biggest concern, I suppose, in relation to coronavirus is our response, because when you're dealing with risk, you have to look at two things. There's the actual risk and trying to understand that and address it, but there's also how we react to the risk and our actions in response to it. And they, in many instances, become more problematic than the risk itself. Now, in this regard, I personally don't think that shutting down the whole of society has been an effective or proportionate response. And I'm not simply going into that, are we protecting the economy versus protecting lives kind of argument. I think it's important to recognize that the economy is lives in many instances. We're talking here that an economy that's smaller in 5 or 10 years' time will not be one that supports a health service in the same way as we've become accustomed to. And it's not simply lives in the future of young people who are healthy today, and we know many people who haven't been screened for their cancers or diabetes or whatever else, but also economic activity gives people a meaning to their life. So actually right now, by removing people from their workplace, we are undermining people's well-being. I think those are really important things to bear in mind. I think the very final point I'll make about coronavirus, I think that, there's a lot of debate and heat, and we need to be open to all different opinions from whatever quarter it comes from. I think there's an unfortunate schism that's open between supposed experts and the lay public. But actually, as we all know, in many cases, particularly when we don't know what's happening, opinions from left field can be just as important and useful in the long term.
Well, there's a cultural issue there as well, because as you well know, not just in Europe, but across the world, many countries have reacted to this COVID-19 in different ways, whether in Asia or in the United States or in Latin America or in Western Europe. And here in Switzerland, the way it's perceived and the way it's handled is not quite the same as the way it's handled, let's say, in Belgium or the UK or Spain. So it is complicated, and let's see what happens as the research data starts to come in. Bill, many thanks for casting welcome and much needed light on this debate and the complexities, and for being so informative. My guest today has been Professor Bill Durodie of the University of Bath in England. Bill, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Michael.
That was the McKay interview with Michael McKay. And don't forget, you can hear that interview again on our website, worldradio.ch.